Treblinka, January 3rd, 1943. When the entity hovered above the ground, some 200 feet in the air, the northern part of the night sky was completely obliterated by a thick, greasy cloud of black. They'd started burning the bodies on giant open pyres, and the billowing smoke looked like a demon rising from the earth. The entity hadn't been awake for long, but the old ways returned to him rather quickly. In all of the world's history, death was the one thing most common. The one thing that united something as vile and wicked as he with those common men and women who drew breath. And the entity thought this was quite good. In half a heartbeat, he was standing on the ground, but no one could see him unless he so chose it. The hour was late, no more than a few past midnight. Most of the killing took place in the day, and that was the time he normally lingered about. But as the bodies charred and turned black like long slivers of rot, he smiled. Death fed him. His hands, metaphorically speaking, didn't need to get dirty. Not once did he pull a trigger, stab a heart, push someone from a cliff, but he was always there in the aftermath, savoring the aroma as the soul parted from the flesh, tasting it, feeling it warm his insides. He didn't know what he was, but he did know that as long as there was death, he'd survive. It had been that way for years. He was there a decade ago when the Chinese floods killed millions, sweeping clean the shanty villages and valleys with mud. He was there during the Spanish flu in India and Japan, where people coughed blood phlegm in the streets. He was even there for the Black Plague, and what a wonderful time that had been. People died in taverns and churches and lodge houses as regularly as the wind blew. He could still taste that meal. A third of Europe falling to ash, enough that it engorged his spirit and left him satiated for years. Now, it seemed that war was what kept him fed. The current squabble felt across the globe was ending more lives than any of the conflicts to come before, but they simply weren't enough. Not many on this earth could be put to death as efficiently as biology, but still, he rather admired the Germans and their ovens and gas chambers. No one had perfected killing as much as the Führer and his legion of like-minded monsters. Like a ghost and shadow, the entity strolled the camp, feeding on the fear and the freshly killed. The extermination chambers were empty, the diesel tank engines which supplied the suffocating exhaust cold, and a team of Treblinka guards used hoses to wash out the filth from inside. Anyone sleeping within the camp were either Germans, conscripted Soviets, or Jewish slave laborers. No one came to Treblinka for an extended stay. This place was designed for killing in mind, and that's what happened moments after they stepped off the trains. Most of the commanding SS were asleep at such an early hour, warm by their stove fires, but the entity could always count on seeing Franz Stangl. White Death, they called him, walking the grounds, a tiny cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. He'd been out a long time, as evidenced by the dusting of snow on his shoulders. The SS respected him. The Treblinka and Jews feared him. His gaze fell through everyone he encountered, as if he didn't see them, as if he were thinking of new and exciting ways to improve the already lethal Treblinka. A man after my own heart, the entity thought, had he actually had a heart. The entity rarely interfered with the schemes of man, although he could offer suggestions. He found that nature, as always, did better when it was allowed to work unprovoked. And so the entity remained in the shadows, watching men do awful things to one another, and tasting the death that came in its wake. Of all the camps he'd explored, Treblinka was his favorite. Perhaps it was in his weakened state. Perhaps it was the nostalgia for such large-scale efficient killing. But he was growing worried that the hunger would soon be upon him. He was omnipotent, and by such he knew the Russians were pushing from the east, and if the weather worked in their favor, would be here within a year. The Nazis would abandon the camps, most likely hide all the evidence, then turn to whatever front they thought they could win and push back. Either way, the killings would stop. The mass deportation of human cattle would stop. Nature needed to take back the reins. Toward the end of his stroll, just before he retired to his lair, the entity moved up the rail line toward the Malkinia junction. Treblinka was the northernmost of the 3 death camps built in the last couple of years, and it was also the most expertly hidden. Legitimate Polish trains used the route all the time, never once noticing the spur line, never once realizing that just beyond the trees there was a camp. And in that camp, death found almost 15,000 souls per day. A train came each morning, sometimes 2. Franz Stangl ordered the gassing at breakfast, and by the time he had his poached egg and blood sausage brought to his quarters for lunch, the killing was done for the day. But the burning, so late into the Nazis' desire to hide their crimes, never ceased. A train was coming along the track as the entity moved northward. Even the humans would have known it had they walked along the metal, balancing foot over foot with arms held out like a bird, just the way the entity had seen children do ever since train tracks first threw down across the land. The vibration was evident that a long train set of cars would soon present itself. As he met up with it, some 4 miles up the path, past the faux train station at Treblinka, he found it was a steam engine, as they all were, and it pulled a total of 49 cars. The engine looked like a giant rolling coffin, a slick testament to man's ingenuity. These passengers were lucky. They were in third-class passenger wagons, complete with commodities not often seen in train cars bound for Treblinka: window slats and seats. Still, they were crammed inside so tightly that people were stacked like chairs. Most of the trains to enter the camp were made up of freight or cattle cars. In the warmer months, it wasn't uncommon for the majority of the prisoners to already be dead upon arrival. The conductor slowed the train, and a puff of steam hovered in the air above it. As the entity stepped aside, he could see the men operating the engine, 2 of them, simply sit back, breathe tired sighs, and then begin chatting quietly. This was normal. The camp trains had to sometimes stop to let legitimate trains pass first. After all, Operation Reinhard was Hitler's big, elaborate secret. As the entity surveyed the train, he tasted the fear and uncertainty grip each and every one of those aboard. There were over 4,000 sweaty but cold Poles, ranging from young children to the elderly. In his omnipotent mind, he could delve into the heads of them all, pulling out memories, thoughts, wishes, and hopes. If he cared enough to be sadistic, he could replace those with horrid images and premonitions of what was to come. But tonight he didn't. Tonight he was tired and weak, and wanted to be off to his lair. Later he would return and feed from those before him. How he loved the taste of their deaths as their souls seeped away. How their bodies, sometimes upright in the crammed gas chambers, would release a final puff of breath as the Trovniki pulled them to the pyres. Scared voices spoke silently. Though it was dark, a starless sky, even if half of it was blotted out by the oily billow of smoke, the whites of eyes and sheen of teeth could be seen. Glass was not a luxury of this train, and cold lips chattered while expelling little puffs of steam. None of them could see the entity, but he was entranced in their fear. It was almost as delicious as their deaths would be at sunup. He found himself slowly wafting down the line, taking in their faces, so that it might satiate him for a few hours, until a proper meal could be had. They were all wondering why the train had stopped. None were in good spirits, but then again, how could they be? Some of them had already died. The train probably left the Warsaw ghettos a couple of days ago with the promise they'd be heading to work camps across the Bialystok line. Never were they given food or water, and this particular train was open to the elements. The entity tasted the scant few inside the cars who'd perished, but it wasn't as delectable as he'd hoped. They'd been dead for hours, and the freshness had dissipated. As he made it to the 12th car past the engine, he found himself face to face with a child. The adults crowding around turned dull eyes out to the blank, dark countryside, but the child, a little girl no more than 5, who'd never known life outside a ghetto, was looking right at him. Sure, he'd been put to sleep many times, but he'd been around since the beginning of time, and now, in the heart of Poland during the Second Great War, a human was seeing him without his consent. He didn't know if he could speak. That wasn't an ability he possessed. Whenever he influenced the mind of a human, it came to him as an internal monologue. But the humans always heard and they always obeyed. Now he was feeling something he hadn't known in his lifetime. In his mind, he willed the girl to look away, to forget what she saw. But somehow, miraculously, she refused. This anomaly stunned the entity for a moment, and just before he'd made the decision to retire to his lair, the little girl's arm shot through the open portal and took hold of him. He had no arms, no legs, no head nor body at all. What he had was a consuming, flowing darkness that men could only feel, not see. He was as substantial as the smoke coming from the pyres burning Jews just miles down the road, and still, somehow, this child had grabbed him. That was the moment the entity understood the feeling that had washed over him like some kind of holy reckoning. He'd been all-powerful, omnipotent, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, but now he understood. He was afraid.